to the next point on the agenda, which is a joint debate concerning gender equality. We will be dealing with the URTASUN report, Equality Between Women and Men in the EU in 2014-2015. Then the KOZŁOWSKA-RAJEWICZ report, Equal Treatment Between Men and Women in the Access to and Supply of Goods and Services. And finally, the Moody report, EU Funds for Gender Equality. So I would now ask Mr. URTASUN to speak for 4 minutes. Colleague URTASUN, you have the floor for 4 minutes.
Thank you so much. Bueno, en primer lugar quisiera agradecer a...
First of all, I would like to thank all the rapporteurs and everybody who's been working with me on this report. It has been a real pleasure, and I think that we've worked well, and I think we've done well in analysing what is happening at European level. And I would also like to give a special mention to the Institute for Gender Equality, because without their help it would have been much harder to draw up this report. We made use of their analysis, all the index that they drew up, all the information that they gathered together. So from that point of view, I would like to thank them too. Now, the aim is to send out a very clear message with this report, and that is through the data that we have and through indicators and clear analysis, we see that actually we are either standing still or actually moving backwards when it comes to what is happening in gender equality. And this isn't something that's really part and parcel of political or public discussion, and that is why we say that we've really got to look at this. If you look at pensions and the rights of pensions, in half of member states, the gap is widening when it comes to the amounts of pensions, and then when it comes to salaries, 16.2%, almost what we had in 2012, hardly any progress at all. And we've seen only 6% progress elsewhere. Even in political representative, we have moved very slowly, even in this House. Some progress, but not very much. And then when it comes to gender violence as well, this is something that we talk about an awful lot. We're seeing in our member states. But the data that we have, and here I refer to the European Foundation for Fundamental Rights in Vienna, they're talking about women suffering from domestic violence, and the number 55% of women having some form of sexual attack or harassment in their lives. So these are not good figures, and the question that we put and that we discussed among the shadow rapporteurs as well is how different institutions are responding to this issue. And this is true not only at European Union level, but true also in a number of member states, is that gender equality is an issue that isn't really going anywhere. We have had progress, legislative progress, even in some member states. That isn't the case at the moment. And I would also like to refer to some of what is happening in the Council. For example, the Commission withdrew their directive on maternity leave. We do hope that that will come back again. It'll be part of a package, we hope, on the 24th. And of course, we are going to work very hard to make sure that is the case. But then another directive on quotas on company boards, that again has been blocked. Other issues are being reviewed. So we do want to see things happen as quickly as possible, but and all those member states who haven't done what they should ought to be doing that as quickly as they can. But we also want to say that there is a specific measure, and we want to have a specific measure against violence against women within the EU. We think that is absolutely essential. And there are other points that we would like to make, that there is the directive on the number of women on administrative boards. If you look at the results where that does happen, they're very effective indeed. So this, I think, is something that should be unblocked. And then again, the salary gap. There is an announcement this week from Iceland that every company over 25 employees will have to explain the salary breakdown within their companies. That's something we should be seeing inside the EU as well. And the last thing I would like to say is that we really do hope that the EU and the Commission in particular would come up with something again on gender equality. We think that's very important. Thank you.
Mrs. KOZŁOWSKA-RAJEWICZ to speak for 4 minutes.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie przewodniczący. Szanowni państwo, ja również chciałabym zacząć.
Thank you very much. I would like to start by thanking the rapporteurs for very fruitful cooperation with regard to my report. I'm very pleased that we're able to discuss this now in March, which is a very special month, of course. In March, we have had a lot of debate about women's rights, and this has happened all over the world. The unfortunate fact is that after emancipation, it hasn't completely come to fruition because women are still having to fight for their rights. But this is a good time because it focuses people's attention on this matter. We have problems with regard to the gender pay gap, but it's not just economic problems, this is part of the problem. What I've been looking at is the implementation of equal treatment between men and women, the access to and supply of goods and services. This is a directive which is extremely important. It doesn't just talk about the labour market, it also talks about goods and services. So this is the first time that we have been looking at matters outside the labour market. And this is very important because we have to look at women's position in access to goods and services. In some insurances, for example, women have to pay more simply because of their gender. And there's also health matters. We need to ensure equal treatment in the healthcare sector for women and men. And sometimes this doesn't happen. It's very important to stick to gender equal criteria, and this doesn't always happen. We want to protect pregnant women, of course. This is extremely important. There are problems with regard to sexual harassment. This has also been looked at in the report. We have representatives of women's rights in our countries that are involved in implementing European legislation. And we've talked to these people, and the directive has been successfully implemented in all member states. However, in practice, this doesn't always occur. So it happens on paper, but not actually always in practice. And that's why in my report I say that it's quite right for the law to be applied in practice. The paper is quite patient in a way. You could include many more things on equal treatment between men and women, but that will just remain a dead letter without the help of institutions and without adequate funding and without a change in people's minds. So we need to move away from just words and look at the practice. These measures need to be implemented in practice, and institutions need to help this course and support it. In our report, we also emphasize the problem of awareness of equal treatment of men and women when it comes to goods and services. And also we need to look at the new technologies, new phenomena in the market. For example, the sharing economy, Uber and all the other examples of the collaborative economy. We need to ensure that these are tackled as well. And in our report, we also talk about the Istanbul Convention, which is extremely important for women. Thank you.
Mrs. Moody for 4 minutes.
Thank you, President, and thank you to the other rapporteurs for their cooperation and support in writing this document. I am proud to be presenting a report here in the plenary following International Women's Day on such an important topic. And I appreciate the presence of Commissioner Jourová to address and, I hope, follow up on the recommendation the Parliament makes this week. It should be a source of great pride to the EU that equality between women and men has been enshrined as a fundamental value of the Union since its very beginning. I do a lot of meetings and communications in my region, and when I talk about the support the EU provides to women, it generates an overwhelmingly positive response. There are 15 directives supporting gender equality, and it is explicitly the subject of different aspects of the budget. However, we are still a long way from achieving the goal of gender equality. Indeed, if it was all sorted, there wouldn't be a need for this report at all, and I look forward to the day when that is the case. But, in many ways, and for many reasons, I fear we are in danger of slipping backwards. That gender-related issues have fallen down the political agenda, and when they are considered, a certain amount of complacency has taken hold. The report looks in detail at 3 specific areas: European structural and investment funds, rights, equality and citizenship programme, and Horizon 2020. The structural and investment funds provide vital support, particularly for women being able to work and on promoting gender equality. For example, through supporting social infrastructure or women entrepreneurs. But there is not an overall strategy to make sure that there is systematic support to women in these programmes. The Rights, Equality and Citizenship programme includes some very important areas of funding, and this support goes directly to organisations that are working in communities and have the reach and expertise to make a difference. A good example of this is the Daphne programme for combating violence against women. However, this programme also demonstrates the creeping decline in support and focus on equality. It has seen a fall in its annual funding since 2011, despite the heavy demands for this work. The Horizon 2020 framework programme in many ways shows the good work taking note of gender issues can achieve. It does include gender mainstreaming and provides specific support in the research process, in gender equality plans and in research content. However, these efforts do need to be consistently supported by specific budget lines. In addition to these specific areas, the report looks at the budget more widely, including more recently established work. For example, the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund included gender mainstreaming in its founding principles. There are very real and particular issues for women and girls in these situations, and the essential support we provide must recognise those. Overall, I have highlighted where there has been success, but where gender mainstreaming has or should be adopted has also been underlined. For us to truly make progress on ending gender inequality, we must move away from assuming support for women should be siloed in particular programmes and recognise the need to focus on the impact of all EU funds.
Thank you, Mrs. Moody. And now I would ask Commissioner Jourová to give us her introduction on the issue. Thank you.
Mr. President, honourable members, our 2017 annual report on equality between women and men, which was published last week ahead of the International Women's Day, shows that despite progress, there is still a lot of work to be done. On the positive side, the report indicates that new initiatives have flourished throughout Europe in many areas, including on promoting women's participation in decision-making and economic independence and combating stereotypes and gender-based violence. On the more worrying side, it shows signs that Member States may be moving the opposite directions and that in some instances we might even witness stagnation. And we have already heard these worries from your speeches. In addition, the gender gaps in pay and pensions are reducing at a glacial rate. Therefore, the EU has an important role to play to ensure continued progress in all countries, and I am glad that the European Parliament has always been an important partner in this endeavour. Further efforts are needed to close the gender gaps in employment, pay and decision making, and to fight gender-based violence. The Commission is prepared to table a comprehensive and ambitious package to improve conditions of working parents and carers, to better reconcile the work-life balance and support higher participation of women in the labour market. Yes, this is the package which we promised to come with after withdrawing the maternity leave directive. If you remember, I tried to explain that the maternity leave directive has been already implemented, or the goals of this directive, how it was proposed, was implemented in vast majority of member states, and that we need to come with something more ambitious, something covering also more flexibility and better choices for working parents. This is the policy, not only legislation but a comprehensive policy which the Commission is going to propose and adopt in April. I am very looking forward to discussions in this House on this package. Also, regarding violence, as we announced for 2017 a year of focused actions to fight violence against women, and I am glad to see that many actions are taking place to follow this aim at the Member States, but also in this House. In addition, we remain committed to finalise the negotiations for the EU accession to the Council of Europe Istanbul Convention as soon as possible, and we call on Member States to continue their ratification processes. I can assure you that wherever I go to the Member States where they have not ratified yet the Convention, I am pushing so that they do it as soon as possible, because this is also an important step forward in order the EU to join the Istanbul Convention. On women on boards, we heard that it has been blocked. I can only confirm this is true. This has been blocked in the Council. I invested a lot of energy and time to convince the Member States which we need to achieve the necessary majority, which is one big Member State and two smaller ones, namely Germany, which already has the law. And to my biggest disappointment, this has been blocked, and we had to open something which I call second front. So we are now addressing through diversity charter and through many different individual actions the companies directly, so that they change their corporate governance policy and they introduce more diversity in their managerial culture. And I believe that in the meantime we will be able to push the Member States to change their position so that we can adopt the Women on Boards Directive. The Commission also welcomes the report on implementing the principle of equal treatment between men and women in the access to and supply of goods and services. We will remain fully committed to ensuring gender equality in the access and provision of goods and services across the EU, and will ensure that the directive is fully and correctly implemented in all the Member States. Promoting gender equality, of course, requires allocation of adequate funding possibilities at all levels. The 2014-20 funding programmes already provide means of promoting gender equality and gender mainstreaming in key policy areas. Examples include the European Structural and Investment Funds, in particular the European Social Fund and the European Regional Development Fund, are key financial sources for promoting equality, for example in access to employment, career progression, reconciliation of work and private life, equal pay for equal work, the labour market integration of migrant women, and investment in the provision of childcare infrastructure. Also, the Rights, Equality and Citizenship Programme co-finances national and transnational projects promoting equal economic independence, overcoming rigid gender roles and stereotypes, and raising awareness of the gender pension gap and its causes and consequences. It also invests in preventing and combating violence against women by financing projects supporting victims of violence, training relevant professionals, raising awareness and preventing violence linked to harmful practices. And there are also other programmes such as Horizon 2020 or the Development Cooperation Instrument that are instrumental in promoting gender equality and gender mainstreaming. Currently, gender budgeting is not applied systematically to the EU general budget. However, indicative funding for gender equality can be provided for programmes that include a clear gender equality objective and use gender equality indicators, allowing for the specification of allocated amounts. The strategic engagement for gender equality provides an overview of EU-level funding of €6.17 billion allocated to achieving the targets and objectives of the strategic engagement. This report and its recommendations are very timely as preparations for the post-2020 EU funding programmes are starting. Ladies and gentlemen, the promise made 60 years ago in the Rome Treaty of equal treatment between women and men must continue. It is an achievable goal if we all join efforts to deliver on that promise. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now for the Legal Affairs Committee, Ms. Maštálka.
Děkuji, pane předsedající.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I'm now speaking as the rapporteur of the Legal Affairs Committee on the equal access of men and women to goods and services. This directive is little known, although it covers such significant topics as equal access to employment, healthcare, employment, social services and housing. The Legal Committee found that there are still shortcomings in its implementation. In certain cases, certain services are provided only to persons of one gender. In certain cases, different prices are charged for the same services. Special attention needs to be paid to pregnant women or to parents and carers for small children. In gender area, we've yet a lot of work to do, such as equal pay conditions for equal work. We've yet a lot to improve. Thank you.
Please, sorry, Rubial. I beg your pardon. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, President.
Thank you very much indeed, President. In the European Union, we are totally committed to gender equality. We recognise it as one of our fundamental values and objectives, but we still haven't gone far enough. Different studies have shown that over the last decade, we have slowed down in reducing equality. We're actually moving backwards. And so we need to breathe new life into this. That's why the Budget Committee has made various proposals. We're calling, for example, that all the chapters in the budget should have clear gender objectives and should earmark a budget for that. And that projects financed by the EU should have gender indicators both in project selection and in monitoring and assessment. That the quantities established in the multi-annual financial framework should be a first step. But the cost of inequality is enormous, as we can see from the latest figures, so we have to work further on this. We have to promote genuine gender equality for the next financing period. We need true political will to achieve these ends and to establish a fairer and more equal Europe for everyone, men and women alike. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. On behalf of the Budgetary Control Committee, Mr. Flanagan.
I'm here on behalf of, I suppose, the bean counting committee, but given what was said in this chamber in the last month, I've got to say this. Less than a generation ago in my country, young unmarried pregnant women were treated as lesser beings, their babies consigned to institutions run by so-called religious orders, where some were starved to death, others were sold to be experimented on by big pharma, less than 50 years ago. The young mothers themselves were often consigned to a life of slavery and the abuse in the Magdalen laundries. Things have moved on, but we still have a long way to go. But we don't have to go back decades to find unequal treatment of women. We don't have to go back to Ireland, while we don't even have to go outside this chamber. Just this month in this mini plenary in Brussels, one of our supposed colleagues made the statement that because women are smaller, weaker, less intelligent, they should be paid less than men. I have news for that MEP. There are women in this chamber who are bigger, stronger and more intelligent than many men. That, though, doesn't make them superior to any man. It makes them equal to all. And I hope we can go some way to changing what we need to change even further and shutting people like that up.
Thank you very much indeed. We now move on to speakers on behalf of the political groups. On behalf of the EPP, for 2 minutes, Mrs. Šojdrová has the floor.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I would like to comment on the report on equality between women and men in the EU in 2014 and 2015. In particular, I would like to thank my colleague, Mr. URTASUN, who managed to compile many important information outlining the main trends in this area. The report concludes there has been some improvement, however small and partial. It is very positive to note that at present we have 60% of women in the universities. At the same time, we have 29% of women in politics, which is a certain increase. However, at the same time, we cannot be happy to see further inequalities, such as 16% difference in salaries, 40% difference in pensions. At the same time, we see more men in the management of companies. In some companies or in some areas, 71% of men. At the same time, we can see a large level of violence, namely 33% of women in the EU have experienced a certain form of violence. However, what is the main obstacle to ensure better division of caring roles in families is the fact that many member states do not provide conditions for father leave. Fathers cannot take the parental leave. Many countries do not provide paid leave for fathers. So it is not that women are discriminated only because they are women, but they have some difficulties in certain countries, in certain societies, because some of their roles, such as being mothers, cannot be really replaced by other people, and we do not provide them with sufficient conditions. And we see that the vast majority of caring persons are still women. So these are also reasons why we still see differences in salaries. However, I cannot agree with the conclusions of this report, which provides very unilateral view of women as carers and provides for certain stereotypes. So I will suggest several amendments, and unless my amendments are approved, I will not be able to support this report. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Mrs. Garcia Perez for 2 minutes on behalf of the S&D.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Commissioner, I would like to begin, of course, by thanking the rapporteurs and the shadow rapporteurs for all the work that they have done on these reports. I think that it is essential that today this Parliament become the spokesperson for those people who are voicing a concern on the fact that when it comes to gender equality, we are stagnating or moving backwards in the European Union. Yes, we have made progress. Of course we have. And of course we are an example when it comes to our policies. If you compare us with countries outside the EU, one of the fundamental values of the European Union is equality between men and women, equality of opportunity and rights. But unfortunately, over the past few years, policies and politics have meant that we have moved backwards, both in economic policies and in the recognition of rights. The austerity policies had a very serious, deleterious effect on public policies and public services that women often had to have access to when trying to reconcile their work and home lives. But we have seen a number of examples where member states have tried to legislate on our own lives, on our own freedom of decision. And I think that this shows us clearly that there is need to make progress when it comes to recognition of our rights. Because if we do not recognize the work that we still have to do, it is very difficult to get that work done. We have to fight against gender violence. We have to fight against the salary gap and the pension gap as well, of course. And when it comes to the budget, well, we have to look at that from a gender point of view as well. And nor can we forget political representation for women, because women are represented in all those areas. And we have to be represented in those areas where important decisions are taken about our life. Trade unions, in politics, in economics as well. And we have to have the opportunity to advance. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. On behalf of the European Conservatives and Reformist Group, Mrs. Wiśniewska, 1.5 minutes.
Przewodniczący, koleżanki i koledzy.
Thank you very much. Women's rights and the equal treatment between men and women are issues that should really unite us here in the European Parliament. Of course, I think it's a great shame what one MEP said, who expressed himself very pejoratively about women's rights. Of course, can't go along with what he said. It's with great regret that I heard that. In the Women's Committee, we often talk about ideological matters, and I don't think that's a very good way to proceed. I think in our committee, in the Women's Rights and Gender Equality Committee, we should be basing ourselves on good practices in member states of the European Union, how to overcome the pay gap between men and women, for example. In Poland, we actually do have a very good example of this. The pay gap is virtually at the lowest among the countries of the European Union. And if one were to continue along this path, then at some point in my country there will be no pay gap. So we really do have to fight for this happening. The disparity between men and women when it comes to pensions as well, that should be as small as possible. Of course, we should be fighting against violence that is perpetrated on women. Any kind of violence is wrong, psychological or physical violence. But here I'm looking towards the left part of this chamber. You should listen to the conservative voices as well, because you've got to help women who want to be mothers. And your left ideology shouldn't dominate.
Thank you very much indeed. You have a blue card.
You have a blue card from Mr. Polčák. Do you accept it? Κύριε Polčák, έχετε 30 δευτερόλεπτα.
30 seconds, Mr. Polčák.
Děkuji za akceptaci modré.
Thank you for accepting this blue card. I have a question for you, colleague. Well, you said some interesting comments. However, what do you think of the situation in Poland? Because in Poland there is no such difference in salaries in Poland. This is clearly proved. However, in other countries, for example, in my country, in the Czech Republic, we have big differences. For instance, 22% difference in salaries between men and women. So what do you think of this situation? We should clearly denounce it, I believe.
Dziękuję bardzo. Ja myślę, że
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. I always accept questions directed to me, unlike some colleagues that think that our questions shouldn't be answered. Anyway, cooperation between ministries in the member states should be a good basis for exchanging good practices. As far as I know, our Minister for Women's Matters, Women's Rights, meets frequently with the corresponding minister in the Czech Republic, but also in other countries as well. And they try and discuss ensuring that there's equal pay for equal work.
Thank you very much indeed. 3 minutes, Mrs. Becerra, on behalf of the Liberals and Democrats. President, Mrs. Jourová, Mr. URTASUN, Mrs. Moody, congratulations for these very timely and needed reports. It's so important, more now so than ever before, to recall that equality in Europe is still work in progress for everyone. The salary gap is something we should be ashamed of as Europeans. It's not a myth, it's a fact. The figures don't lie. The salary gap stands at about 20% in Europe, twice 40% for pensions. And for those who say that this is just a matter of what we believe in, don't get this wrong. The devil lies in the details. It's not a question of a European woman taken on being sold less because she's a woman. That's not the case. I'll give you an example. Jobs are given different names but require the same qualifications, and men in those jobs are better paid. These are facts. A secretary and a male administrator with the same jobs, the same responsibilities and roles get different pay. A female cashier in a supermarket is paid less than a male shelf stacker. In other words, it's a question of the description and the value placed on these posts. So what is the best antidote for this? It's transparency. Publishing the list and the pays by companies. And with the height of hypocrisy, certain people say that this salary gap is a free decision of women. Some things are improving, yes, certainly, but only very, very scandalously slowly. The European Commission says that if we don't backtrack, it's going to take 70 years until we close the salary gap. 70 years. We cannot wait 70 years. Actually, it took a little bit more for Mr. Korwin-Mikke, who's not here, a little bit more than 70 years to make himself famous thanks to his cheap, xenophobic, racist and sexist statements in this chamber. And Mr. Tajani, I hope, will sanction him in the near future. I hope it will be the highest possible level because, as I say, Mr. Korwin-Mikke is not here to listen to this, but so I find it very difficult to believe that we get the same pay, that the European citizens have to pay the same taxes to pay you and me, and that our vote has the same weight. But these are the rules of representative democracy. There is no salary gap between MEPs. Mr. Korwin-Mikke gets the same as Marine Le Pen, or Mr. Farage, or me as well, anyone here. The gap we have to close in the Parliament is the one of those people who look down or ridicule our work, which shows basically, the only thing it shows are the philo-Nazi sexism and unfair appointments. Genuine equality between men and women will not be the victory of some over others, but rather a shared victory. And we really have to fight, all of us. We will earn something with a fairer society. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Mrs. Becerra.
James, do you accept it? Παρακαλώ, κυρία James, έχετε...
Mrs. James, you have 30 seconds.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for accepting the blue card. I was formerly an EFDD member. I now sit as an independent, but I do take issue with your accusation against Mr. Farage. Can I just ask you, what do you feel about a political party whose membership has, in terms of women, has probably got the highest representation from a particular country and probably represents the best in terms of women's political future, and how does that stand in terms of the points you tried to make with the accusations you made?
Mrs. Becerra, 30 seconds. Well, I'm delighted that your party has so many women, but basically your party is looking to destroy the European Union. We're looking at equality in general, but equality between men and women as an underlying pillar, and that's one of the things in the European Union. So I see a contradiction in what you say. It's one of the main pillars here. I think it would be better for you to be involved in actually building rather than destroying. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. On behalf of the European United Left, Mr. Eck for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, last week there was the International Women's Day, and we used that occasion to flag up the terrible situation that still exists when it comes to equal treatment between men and women. During the last plenary session in Brussels, a colleague had to unfortunately remind us that even in the European Parliament, Middle Ages, the situation still exists with regards to, it's almost like the Middle Ages because certain statements are being made, and it just shows that there is still so much discrimination today. There's something that I wanted to talk about, and that is that we're seeing a growing feminization of poverty in the EU, and this is triggered by the austerity measures that are being imposed upon everybody, particularly when it comes to public services and healthcare services. These austerity measures lead to a jeopardization of healthcare provided, particularly for young children and for old people. The quality is suffering. And often also with care services, these are being impacted upon. And I would like to thank the rapporteur, because the rapporteur has mentioned these problems and has called on member states to support horizontal cross-cutting solutions to try and counteract these terrible developments. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. On behalf of the Greens, for 1.5 minutes, Mrs. VANA. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. I would like to congratulate Mrs. Clare Moody for the excellent cooperation on her report on gender equality. It's been said time and time again that this is a very well-timed report, bearing in mind International Women's Day as well. So we really do welcome this report. It speaks very clearly and points to some rather unfortunate situations, particularly with the lack of implementation of gender mainstreaming, which we all know is a commitment on behalf of the European Union, a requirement. So we are responsible for getting this implemented. But the EU funds, the EU programs in particular, that's not the case. And that's shown very clearly in the report. So we need to catch up here. And we call for the implementation of gender mainstreaming in all EU programs and under all EU funds. A key instrument, a key tool in gender mainstreaming is gender budgeting, as various speakers have already mentioned today. We believe that the European Commission is really dragging behind the possibilities of implementation, although time and time again over the years this House and also the Women's Committee and other committees have been calling for gender budgeting to be used not only in those areas where it's easiest, almost obvious, but across the board. And I would like to stress the importance of the European structural funds for improving the situation in the crisis and achieving equality, also encouraging public investment in social infrastructure and gender-specific issues for overcoming the crisis. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. On behalf of the Europe of Freedom and Direct Democracy Group, Mr. AIUTO.
Grazie, Presidente. Cari colleghi.
Thank you very much, Chair. Colleagues, I would like to congratulate the rapporteurs on the very good work that they have done. But if I may, I would like to take advantage of this discussion to address a few words to those who think like our Polish colleague. I know he's not here, and I know that we're very few of us here. But these people, perhaps you know that in 2012, there was an Italian physicist, Fabiola Gianotti, who made a discovery. Now, she was the greatest researcher on stem cell research, was also Italian. I come from the Abruzzo, where we have an institute on nuclear physics. And you know who runs that? Lucia Botano, a woman. So we, colleagues, as women, show our value, our capacities and our competencies every single day. And so we are claiming the equal treatment economically, at work, and when it comes to pensions as well. And anybody who thinks that women are inferior in any way at all to women is right in only one thing, because contrary to a man, no woman would stoop to such a level, such as our colleague did with the comments he has made. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. AIUTO. On behalf of the Europe of Nations and Freedom Group, for 3 minutes, Mrs. TROSZCZYNSKI.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Les rapports débattus.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. These debates that we're having shows that we have a dual objective here. We've got to try and ensure that we rectify the situation, but we need to look at the ideology here, the defending of our noble ideas, but it seems to be there are a number of communitarist requirements in these reports. Also, the access to goods and services. There are some good suggestions put forward, creating infrastructures to help women that have children, and also legal protection for these women as well. But again, it's rather ideological. We're talking here about fighting discrimination based on sexual practices. And the report, Mrs. Moody's report, critiques the use of funds when it comes to equal treatment between genders, that there's a lack of control, lack of monitoring here. Again, it all comes down to the communitarist approach, and also the creation of specific funding to ensure that there is security for migrants. And there is a lot of funding here, just for the situation in Greece. 100,000 euros per head, but that's taxpayers, of course, that are paying that. But what's being asked is 18 million euros for the Daphne programme to try and fight against discrimination against women. But it seems to be symptomatic, really. The Women's Committee seems to keep harping on about gender, but it's ideological again. It seems to be, they just seem to be high ambitions, but it seems that sexual practices has nothing to do with this sacred equal treatment. Mr. URTASUN, you go in the same direction. Discrimination towards LGBTI, and on their sexual practices you want to penalize homophobic approaches, and you want to give LGBTI people a special status. Treatment between men and women, it seems to be something that doesn't actually happen. Categorizing people according to their situation and pitting them against other categorizations. Men against women, immigrants against other people, LGBTIs against heterosexuals, and the list goes on. This is terrible. The Charter of Fundamental Rights guarantees in all societies freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and putting that and calling that into question is taking away people's rights to actually do this. Thank you.
1.5 minutes, Mrs. James, non-attached.
Equal treatment in the eyes of the law is a fundamental principle in a liberal democracy. No one should be discriminated against for their gender, their age, their race, their sexual preference, or even their physical ability. But neither should people face positive discrimination and be placed ahead of others to satisfy quotas. This is just as unjust as other forms of discrimination. Now, the United Kingdom has led the way in a whole series of areas. It gave women the right to vote in 1928, and via other acts of parliament it's guaranteed rights to equal pay, equal access to jobs, from genders and for all sorts of cultural and societal reasons. We were even one of the first countries to elect a female Prime Minister, and we've also now got a second one. So the United Kingdom has got a long history of enshrining equality in law. Now, nevertheless, there is work in progress. We recognise that. We understand and we appreciate that in some areas, Scandinavian member states are ahead of us, and yet in many areas, the United Kingdom stands head and shoulders above other member states. Now, simply put, the United Kingdom expects and requires that women and other issues relating to this topic around the world should receive equal treatment and equal opportunities, and that discrimination should be made an element of the past. But these are challenges best delivered and best addressed by national sovereign parliaments. If we take away that role, if we take away that control, all you do is sow the seeds of discord, disillusionment and division.
Thank you. For 2 minutes, Mrs. Le Grip.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, well, regularly in the hemicycle around the 8th of March, we sum up the situation altogether. This evening we're debating 3 reports which have been debated and voted in the Women's Committee. I am going to start with a few words about the report from our colleague Mrs. Moody. And I'm speaking here on behalf of Barbara Matera, who was the EPP shadow rapporteur on this report. But her child has been born, so she's not able to be with us this evening. Anyway, this report from Clare Moody is about the question of bringing in funds for gender equality in horizontal programs, and we have equality and citizenship, and Europe 2020 has specific action also in support of gender equality. The first program is absolutely crucial for the funding of actions to combat inequality, but the Europe 2020 program also makes it possible to develop funding so that you can have women workers. These are 2 of the major priorities of the EPP. In our work on the Moody report, as a group, we strove to stress the major role played by the European Social Fund in financing anti-discrimination projects against women and in funding promotion projects promoting gender equality. And we also wanted to draw people's attention to the need to maybe concentrate the European funds more that fights inequality, focus them more on projects which are very specific, where impact assessments have been conducted, and feedback has also shown that they genuinely are effective and there is a positive result. Once again, let me stress that it is important that European funds should be used, should take very much to heart the need for these priorities, but also we have to work very carefully in managing the work of the money of the European taxpayer. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Mrs. Blinkevičiūtė for
Thank you, Mr. President. Commissioner, I'm very happy to see you here today. I would also like to thank all the 3 rapporteurs and the shadow rapporteurs for their great work. But despite numerous legal acts, recommendations and strategies on gender equality, the reality shows that we are only halfway through towards achieving it. And we can say that today we are moving forward at a rather slow pace. There is still no progress as yet in the reduction of gender pay gap. Maybe some member states have achieved better results, but according to the latest data of the Eurostat, over the 5 past years, the gap has even widened in a number of member states. And this means that women will get lower pensions and that there will be more poor women. We should also remember that it is more difficult for women to reconcile professional and family life. They give birth to children, they look after them, and they often are the carers of other family members. And later on, women have fewer career opportunities and lower social guarantees. Madam Commissioner, we are looking forward to your new proposals on reconciling professional and family life, and on new proposals on the directives on 4 types of leave. We should also draft measures directed against violence against women. Member States should also ratify the Istanbul Convention. So far, only about half of the Member States have adopted respective legal acts. We should ensure gender aspects in all areas of our policies. We should ensure gender mainstreaming. We should be united and we should act together. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Girling now for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Over the last week or so, what with International Women's Day and rather odious comments from a rather odious colleague, the issue of gender equality has been very prominent. On the one hand, this is incredibly encouraging, as it demonstrates the broad recognition that inequality is unacceptable in this day and age. But on the other hand, it's also a little bit sad, as despite the overwhelming consensus that there is absolutely no reason why women should be treated differently or be more restricted in their life choices than men, women are still battling to put an end to unjustifiable forms of gender discrimination. This I find quite exasperating. Of course, putting an end to gender inequality is not easy. It's a sad truth that such inequality is so deeply embedded in our society that it has become a form of socialisation that many are simply unaware of. Choices made in education and decisions taken with regard to work-life balance are all to an extent influenced by some form of gender stereotyping, which can lock women into situations or careers where they are at an unfair disadvantage to men. From society, women and girls need positive role models to help them see beyond such entrenched stereotypes. From member state governments, they need a level playing field that allows them the chance to pursue careers and shine based on merit alone. The increased willingness and growing urgency for action opens the door for change. However, unless this willingness translates into meaningful action, there is absolutely no guarantee that gender inequality will be fully resolved. It is member state governments that will make this happen most quickly and most appropriately. It is therefore vital that we as policymakers use this momentum to pin gender equality at the top of all our government's to-do lists.
Thank you very much indeed. Mrs. MLINAR for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Commissioner, I'm very pleased that we're holding this debate on equal treatment between men and women today. International Women's Day was celebrated on the 8th of March, of course, last week, and it's even more important to continue to put this very high on our agendas, because we have still a long way from achieving equal treatment between men and women. We really do need to continue our efforts to achieve these ambitious goals, because we've all set them down as our own goals at EU level. We'll be voting on these very important reports tomorrow, and each individual report aims to tighten up women's rights and to reduce discrimination. And a very important point in all of these matters is that we as politicians need to take into account gender mainstreaming on a day-to-day basis, because particularly when we are thrashing out policies and looking at the implementation of those policies, the difference between men and women is still very visible. And that's why we have to take into account the different difficulties that men and women are confronted with in their daily lives. We need to put more focus on these things. European legislation on equal treatment between men and women are not always uniform enough, and implementation needs to be stepped up. Also, the resources of European agencies and the independence of European agencies involved here needs to be increased. I'm very pleased to be able to work with our colleagues here between the Parliament, the Commission and the Council, because my aim is to reduce this discrimination further. We often talk about courage. We need courage to put our ambitions into words and to implement them, but we need to stand by our convictions as well, and that's why feminism, gender equality, equal treatment, all of this are not just empty words. They're an essential part of our daily work as politicians, just as it's an everyday life occurrence for our consumers and citizens.
For 1.5 minutes, Mr. Pimenta Lopez.
Obrigado, Sr. Presidente. Aumentam as discriminações que...
Thank you very much, Chair. The increase in discrimination that we have seen in work and in the provision of services just increases injustice when it comes to access to decent work and an equal salary. This we see particularly in added value sectors such as the banking sector, where we have more of a differentiation between men and women because of factors such as maternity, pregnancy as well. And then there are further factors of risk for these sectors when it comes to credit and loans, and then access to medical services. Here again we see discrimination. We see practical discrimination that we have to both condemn and eradicate. What we have to see is better access to free quality services in sectors such as health. We have to have support for pregnancy, maternity and kindergarten creches. There are difficulties when it comes to eradicating such differences, but and we see this in a number of areas, particularly because of austerity, and we see it particularly in areas where we have low salaries and poverty. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. For 1 minute, Mr. Solé.
Gracias, señor. They have done. Europe needs gender equality, not only for the sake of social justice, freedom and dignity for all human beings, but also to foster economic development, prosperity and well-being across the Union. We cannot wait another 70 years, as the Commission estimates, to achieve full gender equality. We need to speed up the rate of change now. And for this, we need specific policy initiatives and political commitment from every single European government, also, of course, the European Commission. Advancing legislation in the following areas seems to me essential: fostering equal sharing of care responsibilities and domestic work between men and women, suppressing gender pay gap under the principle of equal pay for work of equal value, better regulation of parental leave and maternity leave, improving access for women to decision-making positions, and finally, fighting gender-based violence.
Mrs. Parker, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. In a report regarding EU funds for gender equality, there is a call for more EU funding. Whilst I fully support tackling violence against women and discrimination and agree that Member States should do more and increase an EU budget that's utterly against UKIP principles, taxpayers' money should not be spent by unaccountable EU bureaucrats. Another report reviewing equal treatment in the access to and supply of goods and services welcomes the ECJ Tester Shah ruling. This removed Article 5(2), which meant that insurance premiums couldn't be calculated differently between men and women. I find it extremely hypocritical that the EU wants gender quotas in boardrooms, but one of the few advantages that women could have had, that was justifiable, so long as it was proven by credible data. You're more than happy to take that away. What once was a transparent way of calculating premiums has now led to insurance companies finding hidden alternatives. For example, basing premiums on employment sectors which have a higher percentage of male and females. The final report on gender equality calls for gender quotas on boards of listed companies and encourages Member States to dissolve companies that don't tick those boxes. It goes on to call for gender quotas for elections, and in the explanatory statement it talks about the division of household responsibilities. How couples choose to divide household chores between them in the privacy of their own home is not an area for the EU to dictate. I'd just like to remind everyone that the United Kingdom passed the Equal Pay Act in 1970, predating our entry into the European Union in 1973. The UK do not need to rely on the EU for women's rights. We will continue to fight for equal treatment long after we have gone. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Mr. Fountulis. All members of a society should have equal rights and commitments, irrespective of their gender. discrimination is not in line with the principles and values on which Western culture has been built. Women have a particularly important role to play in bringing up their children, and they are important in the growth of our society. We have to protect that role. Work should not be an obstacle to women who want to have children. The state should support and protect them, because this could be a solution to the low birth rates. We need to provide even longer maternity leave. We need to support women throughout pregnancy, but also we have to ensure that they have free and direct access to health care. We don't agree with some of the policies which have been put forward, though, because we think that they create more problems than they solve. And during the crisis, we've seen very high levels of employment, both for men and women. We have not got back to employment rates that existed before the crisis, and so the number of families which are dependent on women's work are increasing. We are against all forms of discrimination, either negative or positive, against men or women. Equality has to be there by its very nature. But can we ensure that our values and these principles are going to be continue to exist when we are being flooded by people who come from countries where women are seen just as an object? Thank you very much indeed. For 2 minutes, Mrs. Záborská.
Veľmi mi záleží na rovnoprávnosti žien a mužov a preto ma mrzí, že táto správa je ďalším dôkazom toho, že veľká časť.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry that this report is another proof that people are looking at it on a piecemeal basis and are not looking at the big picture, basically. I think a lot of people are allergic against subsidiarity. Article 7 on the functioning of the European Union says that the EU's activities are based on the responsibility of member states in terms of setting out its welfare policies, its health policies, medical healthcare provision. But irrespective of that, this report in paragraph 46 rather, is asking for women to get access to a broad spectrum of sexual reproductive services, and that should be guaranteed, and that includes abortion and we see that the responsibility for healthcare policies and the organization of healthcare policies and medical care, I repeat, is up to the member states and not the EU. And the laws need to be issued in national parliament and not the European Parliament. A lot of you are trying to, at any cost, put through your ideologies and ignoring reality. And it's one of the reasons why people are becoming more and more disillusioned when it comes to this growing EU integration, because it's...
Mrs. PICIERNO, 2 minutes. Thank you very much indeed, President. Colleagues, these reports that we are debating today are the result of some very intensive, major work, and so I would like to very warmly thank all of the rapporteurs. In particular, I would like to thank Ernest URTASUN. I have worked very closely with him because I was the shadow rapporteur on his report. The statistics which have been put to us by the Commission for the 2 years 2014-2015 are not particularly encouraging, but they are improving. They're going in the right direction, but too slowly. But we don't only need statistics to see how slowly things are changing. We don't need statistics, numbers, to understand how difficult it still is to be a woman. We see that in our everyday lives, in the everyday lives of our friends, our sisters, the women, the fellow citizens that we meet every day before us. And our life in here shows that as well. When these violent, unacceptable language, these disgusting language is used that we heard some time ago. So now more than ever we are aware of the fact that the work we have to do, that the path which will take us to true equality is still very long and tortuous. There is still an awful lot to be done. And many of the things which need to be done are in these reports, which I hope really will prompt member states to do something to guarantee those rights which are so appallingly denied to certain women, the right to sexual and reproductive health, which is still denied to these women today, colleagues. Yes, the points which have been made, the many points which have been made, are all very important. A lot has been said, but let me just remind you all of the last important thing, and that is achieving absolute equality between men and women, and that requires a genuine fight against gender violence. It's a virus apparently these days, taking on new forms. Bullying, violence on the social networks. There's still a lot of work to be done, but we are here ready to roll up our sleeves and get on with it. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Mrs. Žitňanská, for 1 minute.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne, pán predsedajúci. Keď hovoríme o rovnosti medzi mužmi a ženami, nedá mi...
Thank you very much. When we talk about gender equality, we have to deal with a very important issue, namely this pension gap that exists between men and women. This disparity is as much as 40% in some countries and is a result of a lower employment rate among women, a lower salary, and the fact that they also have to look after their families. I think it's important to ensure that we have a more flexible type of employment policy. If you have part-time work, that is something that is very useful for women who have children. And I would be very pleased if we were to be able to find a better way of ensuring more flexibility in companies when it comes to work contracts. We should make sure that women are not put at a disadvantage when they retire. And I think this is the best forum to try and achieve this.
Thank you. Mrs. Vallina, for 1 minute.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner. Faced with racism and patriarchy, we in this House really have to ensure that people really believe in gender equality. It is a political principle in order to move towards democracy and social democracy and rights and a just and fair society. In spite of the fact that we have seen here that the pensions gap is around 40% and the average salary gap is 17%, we still don't have equality and we still have gender violence. 1 in 3 women in Europe has suffered sexual or physical violence against them. In Spain, in the few months of 2017, we've already seen 20 women killed. And we also have to defend our right to put an end to pregnancy freely of our own will, without any attacks. Now, laws with not enough budget or with very little budget, as happens in my country with the law on dependency and others, really are not worth the paper they are written of. We really do have to do something. We have to take this out of politically correct discussion and do something so that we really do have a fair society. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Marcellesi, for 1 minute.
Presidente, gracias al
Thank you very much, President, and thank you very much to our colleague, Mr. URTASUN, for the excellent work that he has done. All of this shows that we are only halfway to getting gender equality, and what we really have to do here is ask, what is it that we are doing while half of women are actually suffering sexual harassment. What are we doing while women are earning less than men for the same job? What is it that we are doing while women are being excluded from management jobs in companies and in institutions? And even more important than that, what are we going to do? Are governments going to carry on with their cuts? Are governments going to carry on blocking rights to maternity and paternity leave and have quotas on management boards? The European Commission has to take up this directive again, and they have to ensure that gender is fully included in all its policies. There has to be a strategy for gender equality. Let's talk less and do a little more.
Thank you very much indeed. Mrs. von Storch, for 1 minute.
Herr Präsident. Wir sprechen heute.
Thank you, President. We're talking about 3 reports here. And we're looking at gender ideology and re-education of people. I think the Neuchel report talked about health dangers that start from the EU, and now we're wondering how people are showing themselves to be against this gender rubbish that people are spouting. I mean, people are either men or women. They marry or they don't marry. They become mothers and they're fathers, and they don't want to, because of certain exceptions and small minorities, see their whole society being turned around and on its head. There are real problems here: work, pensions, health, safety, of course the idea of gender correct nature parks are not part and parcel of this. We should be focused on the real problems. We don't think we should spend any single euro for this rubbish.
Mr. Lavrilleux, for 2 minutes. President, Commissioner, these 3 reports make something very clear. Yes, there's been an awful lot done, but we still have a long path ahead of us before we achieve genuine equality between men and women. These reports have triggered many debates, but they include, for example, the right to abortion and euthanasia. I have to think of Simone Veil, who marked our continent, this hemicycle, so clearly. She was such an amazing president. I also think about the principle of subsidiarity, and also for religious regions, certain national delegations have a different view. But on the question of abortion, whenever it's raised here, I will be in favour. This is a fundamental right. We are seeing the radicalisation of certain political currents, and that's why we need to stand up for these principles. It comes down to common sense. The role of women in the economy and in our companies is something that France has made much progress on. Since 2011, there is the need for balanced representation on boards in companies between men and women. And we welcome the fact that the texts from the European Parliament and the Commission always recommend this as well. Thank you, Madam Commissioner, for continuing to work so that we can finally have a directive on this basis. We've still not achieved perfection yet, but we shouldn't just look at opening up channels of communication. We need to continue fighting for equality, and that's why I will vote in favour of these reports. Mrs. Regner, 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, I'd like to thank the rapporteur, Agnieszka KOZŁOWSKA, for our sound cooperation on this report on equal treatment in the access to and supply of goods and services, because what we're trying to find is equal treatment for everybody in Europe. Gender equality is an indicator of how civilized a society is, and it's a great shame that discrimination still affects people on a daily basis. There are some insurance policies, or rather, if you go to the hairdressers, you pay more if you're a woman than if you're a man. You might have the same haircut, but you still pay more. We've got countless examples of this, the reality. And we've been talking about equality between women and men for years now, and now we need to implement this directive. It's been around for at least 10 years. A lot of the time, the discrimination and the differences are simply seen as being normal. And sometimes you don't even notice them. And it's often women, and breastfeeding women as well, that have to deal with discrimination. They can't use a lot of services. In the airports, for example, they are sometimes just left there, even if they have a perfectly legal ticket. Credit and loans policies, insurance policies, often the policies are gender specific, and there's still this explicit exception when it comes to media, advertising and education. And of course we should all be trying to aim to change that. So it's small steps that will make progress here. We're doing that here at the European Parliament. The Commission has asked for a study on the advertising sector, and I think we should certainly support them in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Škripek, for 1 minute.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne. Vážený pán predseda.
Thank you very much indeed, President. I would like to express my horror at the ORTASUN report. It talks about the fact that clauses being excessively used and that access to healthcare is blocked for women. But there are certain points I'd like to raise because I understand abortion under health, access to health. I really don't think that abortion should be included as part of medical care. Do we want to ban doctors from using this clause of conscience? Basically, I'm not sure that they should have that as a basis with abortion. There are also further points included in here. For example, it talks about political movements and that they are stripping rights from certain groups of people, LGBTIs, for example. Well, why not? Millions of people believe that we shouldn't be turning our backs on the traditional family. Millions of people are against it. So this needs to be respected. Thank you very much indeed. Mrs. González Peñas.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you to the rapporteurs for their work on these reports. And I think that focusing on gender equality has to put people and people being cared for at the centre of policy, just as they are in the centre of our lives. And I think that equal participation of women in the labour market and the inequality between men and women also has to do with the unequal way in which housework is shared. And so we do have to move for a new social system for care as well that allows everybody in society, allows everybody to be cared for, and that values the work of care, so that we do also value the role of that in society. And I think that we really do in the European Union have to ensure that gender equality and the focus on that is included in everything in the work that we do between 2016 and 2020. And we have to also make sure that there is budget for gender policies as well. And if we had that, it would mean that we could actually fight against machismo and violence throughout the European Union in a way that we're not doing at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Engström, for 1 minute.
Thank you, President, and thank you to our colleagues, Mr. ORTASUN, for example, for that report on equality between women and men in the EU. I think it's psychologically unhealthy for the whole society. We've seen that, and the report brings this out among young people. For example, men and women are differently effective, and the fact that women carry out more work in the home with looking after the family, it means that there's a dual or a double problem for them. So they need to have more time to develop their own desires their own, to fulfill their own personalities. But of course, the main thing here is to fight discrimination and to fight violence against women. I think that it's particularly young men, and men in general, that should be made more aware of what is going on. Feminism should really take on a very important role. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Svica, for 2 minutes.
Pa, ako je ravnopravnost muškaraca i žena jedna od temeljnih vrijednosti Europske unije, a to je činjenica još od Rimskih sporazuma iz 1957. godine, kada je načelo...
Thank you. Women have a crucial role to play in the European Union. Back in 1957, we were talking about equal salaries. It was something which also goes back to the Treaty of Rome. And from what I can see, though, from the figures, that women earn 16% less than men. We've heard an awful lot about the reasons for all of this. The Commissioner and other colleagues have mentioned why. I would like to mention some further reasons as well, to give us some food for thought. Firstly, there can be either direct or indirect the discrimination at work. It's prohibited. But there are different professions, different sectors in which women work where they are less well paid than sectors in which men work. We've also heard about practices at the workplace and the systems which exist, which mean that women are less trained, they have less support as well, plus the work done by women is not respected to the same degree, it's underestimated, because it's seen as a demonstration of inherent knowledge rather than actual skills at the workplace. Women work in many fields. They can be scientists as well. So the gender role also influences the choice of education and profession. But there are other reasons as well. And that's the question of women being able to work less, and it's difficult for them to continue their job when they have to try and have a family as well. Difficulties increase, of course, when women become mothers. Now, I believe that with these directives that we have, the best thing to do would be to get down to implementing them. I believe this will be the case, but we all have to work together if we're going to achieve this.
Mr. Škrelec, do you accept it? Please.
Zahvaljujem, gospodine predsjedniče. Poštovana kolegice, interesira me, da li možda znate zbog čega Hrvatska još...
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to know if you know why Croatia has still not ratified the Istanbul Convention. For over a year now, your party has been in power, and the Prime Minister said last year that he would go ahead with the ratification, but there was a major revolt in his party. So can you explain what's happened? Why hasn't this been done? Well, we could have debated this in Croatia. We didn't need to come to Brussels for this. But in any case, we are in favor of ratifying the Istanbul Convention. We have a ministerial working group now in the Ministry for the Family and Demographic Renewal. And I do firmly believe that the Istanbul Convention will be ratified in the very near future. What we are genuinely against is violence against women. It's very sad that the government that was in power for 4 years before us didn't do anything about this. They said it was very expensive, and I do hope that we will manage to do something about violence against women. Mr. Tarabella, for 2 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner. access to and the provision of goods and services are two areas where the equality hasn't really been taken into account. They tend to have been dominated by men, which is why we really do need to take strong steps here. And I think that what we have here does offer us some solid tools to allow us to guarantee equal opportunities for men and women. And if we are to fully implement this, then we have to have awareness raising for both users and the providers of these services. And on the issue of funds of the EU for gender equality, if a number of programs for such financial support exist, very few have really clear objectives, specific means, or are implemented efficiently or are properly followed up. And again, on gender equality, I would just like to say that in general terms, all of us as Europeans and defenders of human rights have to act so that we really do ensure that there is equality of rights for men and women in the professional sector as well. There are a number of differences still in the workplace, and it is because of this that maternity leave in the European Union has been set aside, and we've decided to postpone the discussions also of representation of women on management boards. And once again, I would ask the Commission to have clear measures to fight against sexual harassment at work. Women are still discriminated in the world of work, especially so when they are a lesbian or bisexual or transgender. Do you know that 30% of people asking for work who are transgender have been seriously discriminated against? And there are statistics that show that there are people who suffer every day from a violation of their rights. Thank you.
You have a blue card from Mr. Jurek. Do you accept it? Yeah.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący. W tym ciekawym głosie wyliczył pan różne rodzaje dyskryminacji.
Thank you very much. In your very interesting speech, you talked about different types of discrimination. Do you not think that silence is the most important discrimination? The most serious form of discrimination, the silence of women, the ones that stay at home. They have to stay at home so that they are looking after their children. We know that families with children are often the most vulnerable in society. Why don't we talk enough about women that dispense with work and to work with their families? There are a number of forms of discrimination, but clearly if we concentrate on access to work, access to training, access to study, then we really do have to focus on that. Well, I have every respect for women who decide to stay at home to have their children, to bring those children up. That's their choice, no problem there. But what is awful is that in our society, 60% of people who get through higher education are women, but the higher up the hierarchy of businesses you go, especially in the private sector, you see that women disappear under the glass ceiling. And also when you look at salary levels as well, this is very shocking. We have to do something about these injustices, and it really is awful that this still happens today. There has been some progress, but we have to go a lot faster with it. Thank you.
Mrs. Krupa, for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. The European Union wants to be a leader in the world, a champion of women's rights. But we need to bear in mind that there are physical and psychological differences between men and women. Women would like to be mothers, they are maternal, they might have, and they also might require funding to ensure that their pension at a later stage is topped up enough, so that they have enough. Paternity leave is not the best solution, because the best father cannot replace or be a substitute for a mother. Swedish studies show that fathers that got paternity leave would rather do something else rather than look after their children.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Christoforou for 2 minutes. Thank you very much indeed, President. Well, the time has come for all of us here in the European Parliament to say, let's put an end to the good words. Let's get down to action. The European Commission is particularly responsible for the question of gender equality. Let's say that to the Commissioner. The European Commission, the European Union, with its history, its values, it cannot see itself that it has not made it possible to actually bridge this gap between salaries and pensions, to bridge this gap between the way in which men and women are dealt with. The European Union, basically, I think, is there in order to protect the equality between genders. It's in the hands of the European Union to ensure that we don't need to discuss this year upon year, that we take up days every time to discuss this. It's our duty to support gender equality. There is huge responsibility, but there's a massive challenge out there as well. And we should not avoid looking at what happens in practice. The EU budget basically has to include a gender dimension within the various different programs, projects and the funds which the EU could use to support us in this effort. I would like to express my full respect and admiration for all women, women as workers, women as mothers, but women as fighters as well for their cause. But I'm also proud of the women in my country, Cypriot women. For 43 years they have been refugees, but they've been working, they've been struggling as well in order to be able to go back home, able to stop being actually stuck and isolated, that we can put an end to this martyrdom which has been imposed upon us by the Turkish occupation through the tragedy of 1974. Thank you very much indeed. Mrs. Borzan for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, President. In March last year, the European Commission began the ratification process of the Istanbul Convention. But in spite of that, the Council is putting the brakes on. In the EU, 8 women are victims of violence every day. In Croatia, we have seen that half of men, or half of students, I should say, felt that a man had the right to hit his wife. And so this, especially if she had not shown him the necessary respect. We've seen 100% increase in violence in homes, domestic violence. There is not a minute to waste, not a minute to lose. I did put forward an amendment along the lines of stating that we have to ensure that we teach children about equality. Now in Poland it's happening that abortions is becoming the privilege of the rich who can afford it. So we have to make sure that there is sex education at schools so that women are able to decide for themselves what it is that they want to do with their bodies. And I think that we really have to ensure that we can have all doctors able to do abortions. Thank you.
From Mr. Jurek, but Mr. Jurek put already another blue card. Oh, please use your headphones.
Okay. Dziękuję bardzo.
Because you have used already your right to put a blue card, and you asked also to have an additional right to speak in the catch the eye procedure. So I don't give you that right. Το λόγο έχει η κυρία Stevens.
Mrs. Stevens has the floor.
President, colleagues, I would like to call for an inclusive society with the same duties and obligations and rights for everybody, not just for all genders, but also for women and girls in particular, but also for minority groups and people with disabilities. What we need is more funding, we need quotas, but we need to ensure that there is more equality on the labour market. People have to get the same wage, the same salary for the same work. That's the only way to go forward here. We can only achieve this with more transparency and a thorough assessment of different pay scales and this gap between men and women. And also when it comes to gender-related violence, this is something that we need to focus on. But also violence against men and violence against children. This is a major violation of human rights. There's the Istanbul Convention as well. That needs to be fully implemented to eradicate that kind of violence.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Mr. Pavel.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte, doamna comisar, stimați colegi. Subiectul pe care vi-l aduc acum în atenție se referă la un lucru elementar pentru echilibrul între femei și bărbați.
Thank you, President. This is a very important subject. We are speaking about the equality between men and women at work. And regardless of our beautiful words here, the reality is tragic. If we do not implement solutions, then all our ambitions to have progress in equality between the sexes will be in vain, because it is not the first time when we see in the media that women who left to work, sometimes without a contract in other member states, are subjected to horrendous treatments. And there's a famous case which came out in the Observer about thousands of Romanian women working in the south of Italy in very poor conditions. They are victims of exploitation, of beatings, and some of them are obliged to have sex with their employers. This is why I was saying we should not miss the solutions to elementary problems. And even if it's difficult for us to imagine, before we come to talking about equal pay, some women are confronted with such a reality, and women should not be treated this way anywhere in the world. But still, these things happen every day in the European Union, and I now call upon you all, and especially to the colleagues in Italy, to support any measures that will render these women free and will give them their dignity back, because we should take action regarding the black market, which creates so much suffering.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Marias, for 1 minute. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. Gender equality is the major challenge of our times. Differences between the genders have been reduced enormously over the last few years, but there are huge differences between member states as well, where there is inequality in various sectors. A large number of women are still the victims of discrimination. They don't have equal opportunities to education or on the labour market, and they're excluded from leading roles and decision-taking posts. According to Eurostat, the average number of women on boards of the major listed companies in Europe right now stands at only 23.9%. Also, despite the fact that 60% of university graduates are female, these women continue for every hour's work to be paid less by 16% than men. Also, the crisis and the memoranda have undermined the role and position of women. The biggest challenge then for the European Union is to combat violence against women. 1 in every 3 women has been physically or sexually abused since they were 15. So we need immediate measures to be taken, Mr. President. Thank you. That concludes the round of speakers on the speakers list. We now move to Catch the Eye. 8 colleagues have asked for the floor. 1 of them is not present, so that means we still have 7 people for Catch the Eye. We're in time. 3 of those who've asked for the Catch the Eye procedure have used a blue card, but because we're in good time, I will allow them to speak. Mr. Polčák has the floor.
You have the floor, Mr. Polčák.
Děkuji za udělení slova.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was just waiting for interpretation. As regards the issue at stake, I would like to appreciate that the Polish colleague we were talking about was absent from this discussion, so we were saved from more offences on the address of women here. I would like to appreciate the role of women and their rights, and I would like to appreciate the efforts of the EU as regards the progress of in women's rights. We cannot talk about direct discrimination any longer. We have to figure out indirect discrimination, though. That is obvious from many statistics. In the Czech Republic, as I mentioned earlier, the pay to women is 22% lower than to men, so we do need to do our homework there. And nobody can approve of anything like that. There is a number of ideological statements in the report, but still I would like to support it. Thank you.
Mrs. Ward for 1 minute.
I'd like to thank Clare Moody, Ernest, URTASUN and the other colleagues, both men and women, who are here working together to progress women's rights and gender equality, not just in Europe, but globally. Now, I thought we'd won this battle, that me and my feminist brothers and sisters could take a rest from our work as activists. But we are living through a watershed moment in the history of the struggle for women's rights. Sadly, anti-gender, misogynist, conservative and nationalist parties are trying to roll back the achievements of generations of feminists and take away our hard-won rights, because women's rights are human rights. We must therefore use this as a rallying cry to mobilise a new generation of feminists to stand up for what's right. And I mean old feminists and young feminists, women feminists and men feminists. Together with all those fighting for equality and social justice, we bring together a powerful intersectional movement against sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, racism and nationalism. And we can build a more tolerant and a more compassionate world. Thank you.
Το λόγο έχει για 1 λεπτό η κυρία Τόμασιτς.
Mrs. Tomasic, 1 minute.
Hvala lijepa, gospodine predsjedavajući. Pred nama se nalazi još jedno izvješće koje potiče nacionalne vlade i Europsku...
Thank you very much. This is a report that shows or points the finger at member states that don't agree with leftist ideas. A lot of the proposals actually go beyond the remit of the European Union. The necessary cuts in public services, it's a kind of attack against women's rights. And also the intervening in family matters, how to organize family life. You can't be surprised if, well, I would be very surprised if a legislator were to decide how many hours a person in the family can dedicate to certain tasks in the household. And then free access to abortion, for example. I mean, this is something that is really we need to look at.
Mr. Krelic for 1 minute.
Zahvaljujem, gospodine predsjedavajući. Ja bih prvo čestitao kolegi Urtasunu i kolegici Moody na...
Thank you. I'd like to thank colleagues Urtasun and Moody for the works that they have done and the way they have tried to show exactly what the problems are that women face, not just in the European Parliament but in member states as well, and to call on them all to do what they can to solve this problem. We've heard a lot of mention of the economic situation, that women are underpaid for the same work that they do as men, but we forget that one of these days these women are going to retire, and then they are going to find themselves in retirement with 40% less less of a pension than men would be, which will bring them under the poverty threshold. It means that they may not be able to afford food and other things. Now, 50% is what statistics say. 50% of member states who have ratified the Istanbul Convention. If in 6 months we manage to ratify the Paris Conventions in 6 months, why have we not managed to do the Istanbul Convention when it was put forward a year ago? Thank you.
Mr. Shogo, for 1 minute.
In Romania, every 30 seconds a woman is physically abused, and about 200 women fail victims of domestic abuse. Although Romania last year ratified the Istanbul Convention, there are still a number of practical measures to be taken. The solutions offered by the state do not offer protection for the victims or perspective, either in the short or in the long run. The victims are helpless, and the police are helpless because it takes a court order to restrain the violator from the victims or the people at risk. Therefore, it would be necessary to reduce the time it takes to issue such orders from 72 to 24 hours. And at the same time, sufficient legal protection has to be provided to the victims, even though they may come from a socially disadvantaged background and are therefore financially dependent on the violators. So I also encourage and call upon the Commission to introduce zero tolerance against all forms of violence.
Thank you very much indeed. Mrs. Grappini, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. Gender equality should not be just empty words. It should be a reality, and we speak about gender equality with respect to salaries, to leadership, to accessing credits from the bank, to advertising. Gender should be taken into account in all policies which refer to fighting against violence and sexual harassment. My colleague Emilian Pavel provided you with the latest example. It's about 7,500 women who are sexually harassed in Italy. Promoting gender equality needs a budget commissioner, and this is why I believe that we should finance a lot of specific activities to educate people. Lack of equality can be seen at the level of the European institutions, and I believe that we need to find ways to balance the situation. Unfortunately, lately there has been a lot of regress in this matter. Therefore, I believe, Commissioner, that it is important to establish concrete measures. Gender equality is our common responsibility.
Thank you very much indeed. Now we complete with Mr. Jurek for 1 minute.
Panie Przewodniczący, Panie i Panowie Posłowie, to przygnębiające.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. It's very depressing that during the debate on gender equality, some people from the left side of this chamber have been talking about abortion. That's an act of violence against an unborn child. We don't know. We don't know the extent to which abortion regulations are also an act of violence against women. Women could be encouraged by men to abort, by family members, by the doctors. A woman in this situation becomes a victim of structural influence, and a woman in this situation will feel she has no other alternative. Some people have been talking about doctors that want to save children, want to protect children, but there have been some negative comments. I mean, abortion is an extremely important problem for us.
Thank you very much indeed. That completes the Catch the Eye procedure. And now give the floor to Commissioner Jourová on behalf of the European Commission.
Mr. President, honourable members, I strongly agree with all of you who
said here repeatedly many times that we need to act in this policy of gender equality under the sense of urgency. We desperately need to see the progress, but not only the progress in terms of statistical data, but also the progress in terms of improving atmosphere in our society. And here you know all that we are in a very difficult era of worsening atmosphere in society, so we need to be much stronger in combating all the factors which create this worsening, including online, which is a big topic which have not been covered here. However, I strongly disagree that it's only words what we do. We do a lot of concrete actions. And by the way, what else than words, or what stronger than words we have? I esteem so much, I value so highly the fact that the President Tajani today apologized for the shameful statement which we heard here last week. These are strong words which show the whole Europe the value we stand for. And this is very important, that we will be and we are brave enough to say the words which we believe in. And we do a lot of concrete things to fulfill the promises we make. I think that the debate showed that we are addressing the proper problems by our strategic engagement, because you know that there are 4 priorities: equal pay for equal work, increased employment of women and their economic independence, relevant representation of women in decision-making positions, and significantly decrease level and scope of violence against women in Europe. And we need to use all the instruments we have, not just legislation. And you rightly also repeatedly declared here that what we need is the proper enforcement of the current legislation. We have a lot of anti-discrimination pieces of legislation, and we need to be much better in enforcement. We have to use other instruments also to target better the problem in individual member states. That's why we are using in more frequent cases the so-called country-specific recommendations, which already last year addressed the specific problems in member states. But we need to address the issue of as I said, atmosphere in society. We need to do better funding, we need to fund the proper campaigning so that to address the main problems. You know that we are now organizing very strong and I would say loud campaign which shows that we have the goal of zero tolerance to violence against women, and we are funding and we are organizing the campaign in all the member states, again targeting specific forms of violence in the member states. I would like to say that in the proposals of this Commission you can hardly find any cases of positive discrimination. Please read the latest version of the Women on Boards Directive. This is gender neutral. We want diversity on boards. You cannot find anything which could be called social engineering. Believe me, as somebody coming from a former totalitarian country, I am extremely sensitive about this. And in our package to enable the people to better combine work duties and family life, we are very careful to open the choices for the people to choose how they want to live. If mothers want to stay at home with the children, they can. If they want to go to work, they should not be prevented to do so by the barriers which are still present in the EU. And that's why I am very sensitive about everybody who criticises the Commission by doing the social engineering, because simply it is not true, and I am happy to present this in the new package on work-life balance. Last comment on EU funds. Ladies and gentlemen, I worked almost 20 years in the field of EU funding, and I remember times when there was the goal which was called Gender Equality, I think, and we were, as applicants for the money, ticking the boxes. Gender equal project, yes. And it was so artificial and so discouraging also for all who really wanted to do something to help gender equality, that I am 100% for better use of EU funds for the better policy and better achieving goals in gender equality, but let's do it in an effective and efficient way so that we are not using the EU money for counterproductive results. So thank you for your comments. After every discussion on gender equality, I am more encouraged and more inspired to do the everyday work, and I am looking forward for further cooperation with you.
Thank you very much indeed, Commissioner.
Köszönjük szépen, biztos asszony. URTASUN úrnak adom vissza a szót. Parancsoljon.
Mr. URTASUN has the floor as a rapporteur of one of the reports we've been debating.
Thank you very much, President. And first of all, let me thank everybody for their contributions to this discussion. I think it's been an important one. Now, I have to say that occasionally I get the feeling, as somebody who is relatively young, who does take regard to certain things in society, we find ourselves defending elements of gender equality which we thought we had already managed to achieve, and then we hear some of the things mentioned by our Polish colleagues and others that are actually really quite shocking. But I would like to thank those who have had the petition for signatures, and I'd also like to thank Mr. Tajani for the announcement that's going to be made this week and make it as strong as possible. And I would like to ask everybody, the members of the Parliament, but also the Commission and the Council, to act. Now, we've got two options. Either we wait 50, 60 years to reach equality when it comes to pensions and salaries, which are the calculations that the Commission themselves made, if we are carrying on at the same rhythm we're at now, or we do something. And doing something means really all hands on deck. We'd have to improve legislation, yes, but we'd also, Commissioner, we have to have legislation. We have to, I know that not everything depends on you. I think a lot of it is in the Council, and we're perfectly well aware of that. But we do have to try to work hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, to try and achieve something in the Council. I think let's do something in this legislature. Let's ensure that the Council unblocks this legislation on quotas of women on management boards, and something about do something also about signing the Istanbul Convention. It would be a good signal to send across, because really we get the impression recently that actually nobody is particularly bothered about doing anything about this, not governments or the European Parliament, and it's more urgent than it ever has been that we do something. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ortason. Now for 2 minutes, Ms. KOZŁOWSKA-RAJEWICZ.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie przewodniczący, pani komisarz, szanowni państwo.
Thank you very much, President. Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to everyone who has commented and contributed to my report. I'd also like to thank the administration that has worked very intensively towards this. This debate is more of a has more of a ritual aspect, really. That's why I want to point out 2 points. From today's debate, it has emerged that the problem of household work, but also work in a company, for example. In other words, that there's a problem, there's a conflict between these two things. Representatives of emancipation have been fighting for rights of women to take up their place on the labour market. There shouldn't be a dual burden on women. Household work and work on the labour market needs to be reconciled. The European Commission has come up with some suggestions here, and I'd like to support those. The idea of flexibility is important at the workplace, and also having nurseries, creches, at work, and also the right to gender equality is anchored in our laws, but that right has not been applied, and I'd like to see some more tangible measures taken, not just recommendations, because whenever there are any recommendations, they are not taken seriously, or they are willfully misinterpreted and they are not implemented. So what we need is rigid rules, because otherwise there's always going to be a Mr. Corvin-Mikke who's going to come up with these things. He's not here with us today. Maybe he's talking on television at the moment. He's been broadcast on the radio or something. I don't know, but I'd like to appeal to our media not to invite these people along, because we shouldn't be supporting people saying that type of thing. Thank you, Mrs. KOZŁOWSKA-RAJEWICZ. Now we have Ms. Moody. Go ahead.
Thank you. This has been a very interesting debate. It is notable that each of the rapporteurs and many of the speakers have pointed out that we are at best stagnating on equality between women and men, and in many ways we are going backwards. We should, of course, celebrate the ongoing achievements of the EU in support of women. Indeed, frequently, it is only EU funds that ensure that support. But we must move away from assuming that simply having specific programmes aimed at women means it's job done, that somehow that alone delivers equality. It won't. I welcome the Commissioner's recognition that this report is timely in relation to discussions on the EU budget, and that we should use all means available. The budget must be seen as part of those all means. If we are to make progress, we have to adopt gender mainstreaming across the whole budget, using the many gender budgeting tools that have been proven to work. Unless we recognise the hidden and unintended consequences of the way the budget is used, we will always fail to address our goal of defeating inequality. Thank you for all the support that has been expressed for this report. I look forward to the vote tomorrow, but even more, I look forward to the action to follow up on the report's recommendations.
Thank you very much, Ms. Moody. That concludes that debate. The vote will take place tomorrow. I have an announcement. The President has received a nomination, and that will be put down in the minutes of the meeting. What we're talking about is the fact that